Pam asked about the individual self, the jiva, and its relation to the Supreme Self. And there's been quite a thorough exploration of this jiva. When you peel back the layers of what is meant by the self, by the individual, we eventually end up beyond the personality. And we find that what we thought was the individual self was actually no different from consciousness, pure consciousness, which is the Supreme Self. There is only ultimately consciousness, but awareness has moved away from that realization to limited notions of itself. Vasishta continued, "In every body the jiva exists like a snowflake, apparently heavy and large in heavy and large beings, and light and subtle in small beings." So the jiva is like the tendency of consciousness to identify with things. And the jiva represents that tendency to identify as an individual. And it's extremely subtle. It exists like a snowflake, apparently heavy and large in heavy and large beings, and light and subtle in small beings. This is to do with control, sense of control. We have a few appendages that we can control in a very limited manner. And that's it. Other creatures have got more appendages and therefore more control. For example, insects, the centipede, that's got a lot more limbs, and so it's got a lot more control. And from this ability to be able to waggle a few limbs around, we build up a sense of here and there, me and you, and all the rest of it. So this is an interesting one, being able to move. We can see this mechanism at work if you drive a vehicle. When you learn to drive, you're unsure at first, a little bit insecure, a little bit wary, but eventually you become quite comfortable. And what happens is you identify with the space of the car, with the body of the car. You can identify with it so well that you can move between half-inch gaps between vehicles. How does that work? It's because of identification. We identify with the body of the vehicle. If you're in a big vehicle, then you can actually navigate that vehicle through very busy, very tight streets. Your awareness identifies with the size of that vehicle. It's quite possible it also has an effect on the personality. Does the shape, the size of the vehicle affect the psychology of the driver? I think you'd be hard pressed to make an argument for saying that it doesn't. So I think we've got a good example here of the process at work by which consciousness identifies with the body. Look at how consciousness identifies with the vehicle that you're driving. It's quite extraordinary how it adapts to the space, it adapts to the area of control. We can artificially enhance our limbs, artificially increase our appendages, and our sense of control infuses these extra appendages. So you can enter into a very intimate relationship with your vehicle. Sometimes you know that something's not quite right, even before something goes wrong. In fact, it's possible some people are more in tune with their vehicles than they are with their own bodies. So that's an interesting example. This is how the sense of control, the ability to move things, can give rise to a sense of I. The I enters into the triangle in its own conception. And because it is aware of itself, it believes itself to be a body. though this is unreal and only appears to be real. So we've got a sense of I arising. This is to do with our ability to conceptualise. And you could perhaps argue that the sense of I that arises with driving a vehicle is quite a primitive I. It's quite a primitive sense of being, which is maybe why we get things like road rage. The I enters into the triangle in its own conception, and because it is aware of itself, it believes itself to be a body. Though this is unreal and only appears to be real. So what makes us different from the animals and the insects is the ability to conceptualize, the ability to think about it. So rather than just doing this, we can say, look at what I'm doing. I am waving my hand. We can start building a huge conceptual structure and start asking philosophical questions, because we've got this bit of froth called the mind. And this is where the I enters into it. We say, I am doing this. If I were a centipede, I could say, I am doing this, and look at what I can do here, and so on for my other 98 legs or whatever. In fact, if a centipede could think, it would be in a bad way. There's a story about the centipede that once it does become self-aware, it's no longer able to walk, because it starts thinking about all the limbs it's got to control. So we're told this is unreal and only appears to be real. No, it's not quite clear what this is. Is it the body? Is it the I? Is it the identification with the body? It doesn't really matter, it applies to all three. The body appears to be real, our individuality appears to be real, our identification with the body is real. The point is, it's all a step away from our essential nature. A notion has arisen. The snowflake is a notion which has arisen in consciousness, and it acts like a template, like a seed around which other notions build, other notions coalesce, notions of body, of individuality. In that triangle there is the sheath of karma. The jiva, which is of the very essence of the sperm, exists in that body, just as fragrance exists in a flower. We get this reference to sperm now, which is fairly new. I have to assume the translator knows his job and he's translated this correctly, but it's not a very helpful notion. We don't need to bring sperm into the picture. So we got this triangle between the body and the jiva, and then within that we've got the ego sense arising. The jiva gives way to an ego sense. The jiva, in the sense of pure consciousness, gives rise to a limited notion of itself. And this is a sheath of karma. This is what gives rise to actions and consequences, and the whole thing gets reinforced over and over again. And the jiva, which is the very essence of the sperm, exists in that body just as fragrance exists in a flower. I think the best way to understand this is to take sperm as becoming. It's what gives rise to future notions. And all these notions arise within consciousness. So a certain dynamic has been set up which becomes self-propagating. Even as the sun's rays spread throughout the earth, this jiva, which is in the sperm and which has entered the triangle, spreads itself throughout the body. And this is what happens. Imagine you're in your car. Your consciousness spreads itself throughout the car and identifies with the space of the car, the body of the car. We do this with our own body because of this ability to control. It's a perfectly natural thing. All creatures do this. The only thing is, we make a story about it, a story about me controlling a body.